Hello and welcome to episode 25 of Malcolm Show. So, today I'm going to be thinking a bit more about how autobiographical cybernetic systems function multi in multiple formats. So, the principle I'm aiming to define is that of jargon conversion, right? So jargon conversion for me effectively is a summation of modality. So if you can speak English and you can speak French and you can translate between the two, you obviously have multiple forms of communication. In the same sense that if you can then speak in Old English as well as dialects of English and French, you further your knowledge and gain a deeper understanding, not exclusively of the original language. You also gain an understanding of the secondary language as well as humans generally speaking. And I'd argue that because I think that the more we understand how humans behave generally, the more we understand that language is, pardon me, a formal component of that. It's very difficult for language to exist outwith of having a communicator. And because language cannot exist without an operating conduit, operating system, arguably, necessarily language must have a listener and a speaker, a reader and a writer, ergo an observer and an observee. Now, that functions in multiple scales, not just the microeconomic situation microcosmic situation, although it would apply microeconomic, as well as macroeconomic and macro scale, from macro to micro, and you could even argue cyclically. It's important to recognise that emotional modality via technical jargon as an expression of as an expression of chemical behavior provides insight of cognitive states conducive with behavioral states. So the sooner we figure out how we feel what we feel, the sooner we figure out why we feel what we feel. And a key component for elaborating the idea I'm looking at is that precisely because I want to understand how I feel what I feel, I must also understand the multiple linguistic, the multiplicity of languages that can describe how I feel, not just from a chemical standpoint. So how I feel So we say chemically and affectively. Cognitively. Spatially, temporally. And there's another word there. Physiologically, physically, abstractly. Okay, so if we consider my ability to interpret emotional states via language traditionally viewed as technical terms. So I'm going to counter the point here because I feel that describing chemical behavior as technical terms does a misjustice to the description of emotions in psychological language as affective terms, as technical terms. So to me, attends. So when I'm describing my emotions in mathematical language, or in mathematical terms, or in linguistic terms, mathematical terms, neuroscientific terms, physics terms, quantum physics terms, to me it's all illustrative of how my emotions work in all possible linguistic modalities. The principle of matter I'm trying to clarify is that I don't see the that's incorrect. The differentiation I see, or the differentiation I feel, perhaps wiser, when I express my emotions in mathematical terms as opposed to psychological terms, feels more, if there's a sense of emotional distance existing, it's also simultaneously, oh bother, did not mean to do that with the Queen. It's also, I'm really bothered by that. Sorry, it just, I saw checkmate and went, I saw the possibility of checkmate. The point I'm trying to make is, linguistically speaking, the various languages of emotional expression aren't purely psychological, because you can describe your emotions as chemical processes, you can describe emotions as physical processes, you can describe emotions as neuroscientific processes. You can describe them as even mathematical. Like you can describe them as economical processes, like chemical, economical, linguistic, mathematical, neuroscientific, physical, before getting to psychological. Like to me, that just makes sense. They're not different events. They're not independent of each other. And precisely because I don't see them as independent of each other, I don't see the problem. Now, I'm trying to phrase that in a way that I see it as a puzzle, not a problem. And it's precisely because, from my perspective, I see opportunities for describing my emotional state in language more akin with the mechanics at work. And because it feels more akin with the social dynamics of mechanisms inherent to operational viability of a sensorium as well as the society it participates in, describing dopamine entering my brain as it mixes with oxytocin and serotonin from specific physical encounters or testosterone from other physical encounters, etc. To me, that feels a more precise representation of my emotional state, because instead of just saying, oh, I feel happy, I'm more specifically telling you that I feel specifically, I'm describing specific mechanisms which to me have a more objective which to me have a more objective utility, because once the original utility of correctly describing my languages has been achieved, of describing my emotions has been achieved, then it's a matter of cardinal utility to optimize the precision through which I have described my emotions. So, because original utility is specifically whether or not it's helpful, for me is, I very much view it from my perspective rather than having empathy for the other person's perspective of whether or not I'm being understood. But it's more of an affective empathy than because cognitively I completely understand, I generally understand what they're feeling, and from their body language can infer whether or not I've said something annoying or intrusive or offensive or upsetting. And if I need to correct my language, I can correct my language. The point I'm making is that my correction of language can feel a censoring of how I actually want to describe how I'm feeling, which to me feels like an obfuscation of how I'm feeling instead of an illumination. And to me, describing the mechanisms at work of how I'm feeling from a mathematics perspective is a more it is a defensive layer. And I appreciate that I have a sense of unwillingness with vulnerability because I generally don't enjoy feeling emotionally vulnerable. I often, and this might seem tangential, but it really isn't. It's part of the triangle. It's an adjacent or opposite of the triangle. Is there's a sense of professionability I intend to convey with all of my communication. Because to me, if I'm speaking in a successfully professionally interpretable language, then it becomes increasingly easy to know that what I'm saying can be repeated in professional contexts. And I think that stems from an idea of a fear of being misunderstood, as well as not wanting to be seen as different. And because I don't enjoy being seen as different, I would rather accept that if they're going to see me as different anyway, why not just guide their perception of my difference to view me as different from a way that might frame me more positively, whether that be from the sense of understanding a complex topic or not being distracted by theoretically irrelevant details, as well as just accepting that my emotions, they don't matter as much as some people think they matter. And it does genuinely bother me slightly that everybody's focusing on their emotions all of the time. To me, it's the wrong way to phrase it. It's the style of emotionality that bothers me. Because to me, I am focusing on my emotions because I'm focusing on what makes me feel productive and useful and valuable. That's what I'm focusing on. And because I'm focusing on that instead of, and because I'm focusing on productive language instead of unproductive language, I feel far more. It helps with my self-esteem. It helps me feel less of a loser. And I can imagine the response to that be, but you're not a loser, you do this, you do that. And it's like, yeah, but it's precisely because I'm doing that and this as a way of correctly reframing my emotional states to not feel like a loser that I don't feel like a loser. Because when I don't do those things, aka dismissively speak about my emotions as if it's just, oh, I'm happy, oh, I'm sad, oh, I'm angry, oh, I'm alright, or even with more nuance, like, oh, I feel blissful or joyful or jubilant, however you want to describe it. To me, as consolidatively useful as a vernacular is as part of a vocabulary, to me it feels like an oversimplification of something that to me deserves more complexity. I enjoy the complexity. The complexity to me is more than an emotional defense maneuver. It's also a study mechanism. It's a way of teaching myself how various chemical, economical, linguistic, mathematical, neuroscientific, physical operations all work as metaphorical language or analogous language or even just similes and synonyms for the emotional processes occurring in my mind. And to me that feels a far more useful way to describe my emotions, because I'm aware when I feel good and I'm aware when I feel bad, and frankly those two polarities are all I need. It's pleasure or pain, it's good or bad, it's life or death. That binary reductionism is, from my perspective, a sufficient base from which all other emotions can be derived. Now you can argue that, well, what about confusion? Well, to me confusion is contextually good or bad. It is either good because I don't know how that happened, but I want to find out, at which point I'm learning something useful, and or I'm learning something useful, or I'm badly confused, at which point I must learn something that prevents me being confused badly again. It's it's just it's not there isn't anything more to it than that. And I think the insistence on complicating it further is a reversal of how I feel optimal emotional communication happens. Because when I need to communicate my emotions, honestly, it doesn't take very long. I figure them out quite quickly. It just feels as though I could have been optimizing that time by describing my emotions in more complex terminology as an option of studying, as a studying option instead of an emotional bonding option, I guess. Okay, I see the merit there. So I completely understand how emotional bonding has merit, and to me, I think that describing, yeah, that was about it, technical language as, I think describing psychologically framed technical language as a more precise representation of emotion is a limiting factor, in the same sense of, if you're insisting I speak English when I'm in England, I get it, but if you're insisting I speak English when I'm in France, I'm very confused. And I, there might be specific reasons why you might do that. The point I'm trying to convey is it feels like I'm being asked to learn other people's languages on top of my own language, and people aren't necessarily putting in the effort to learn my language. It's, to me, it's a continuation of the idea, and I'm aware of how this isn't meant to sound egotistical as much as I speak in generally more complex language than the average person, is because why aren't they trying to get smarter? Why do I have to frame it dumber? Is the simplest way to look at it. In a binary format, as Boolean algebra, it's either yes or no, which means it's either, it's a, ordinarily speaking, it's complex or simple, at which point it's either simple or it's not simple, or it's complex or it's not complex. Now, whilst those terms are somewhat subjective, the idea at the heart of the matter here is, okay, vulnerability. So I don't enjoy expressing my emotions because I don't feel a need to express my emotions. Because to me, expressing my emotions is something I'm doing anyway. It's not something I need to specify. With most people in my life, I, generally speaking, can convey what I need to convey or what I feel I need to convey without difficulty. And instead of ignoring my responsibility to be a cooperative member of the collective, I also feel that, well, why can't they be cooperative with my ideals? Why am I the one that's being told is wrong? And I guess part of it is reframing it so I don't see it as an attack as much as reinforcements of, okay, we're here to help, and the way we can help is by you speaking in our language, because we know you speak our language as well as we speak some of your language, but you speak way more of our language. I get that, and I can see how having things that way around is helpful. I feel the resistance I'm experiencing, yeah, it was checkmate, wasn't it? And clock and then clock. because the defensiveness, the resistance I'm feeling, which if we were speaking in electronic terms, to me that feels like there's just an additional resistor in the circuit which is functioning as a result of my parallel circuits synchronizing with series circuits that typically behave in a different sequence of neuronal impulses affecting the overall oscillation. And because the overall oscillation has changed, I feel uncomfortable, is one way to phrase it. And that discomfort isn't meant to be anything more than a description of the legitimate sense of pain I have in my brain. And I don't want to describe that feeling of pain to channel an escape tunnel. It's not meant to be an excuse, it's meant to be a description. So if I understand that pain is necessary for growth, and because pain is necessary for growth, I must experience pain in order to grow, whether that be lifting weights in the gym or reading books in a library, it's the same, because to me those terms are synonymous. They describe the same principle of exercise, which is, to me, again, if you continue that analogy with a synonym, is behavioural conditioning. And all I'm doing is altering certain nuclei and neural networks in my mind, in my brain, as a consequence of my mind perceiving my brain as functioning suboptimally because my girlfriend described my emotions as causing difficulty in interpreting me directly. And whilst that was communicated with a sincere intention of helping me develop a more intelligible communication style, I also felt it was an opportunity for me to develop my communication skills, because if that's how she feels about me describing my emotions, instead of responding to that negatively and feeling that I'm being viewed as lesser, I can accept that the constructive criticism came from a place of love, was well intentioned, and was spoken as gently as possible in order to optimize the correct interpretation of the emotions at work, which were love and respect, trust, truth. And to me, I see that as an opportunity to accept responsibility and improve my emotional well-being, because I will have additional words in my affective vernacular as part of my total vocabulary. It's in the same sense as just having more denominations of currency in the bank account. It's having more tools to fight back with. It just, to me, seems it's discomforting and it's scary. And it's a different kind of scary. And now I'm lumping scary in there because you get good scary and you get bad scary. And to me, that's where it becomes ordinal utility of good and bad becomes the cardinal utility of how far into good or bad is it? Is it interesting good? Is it confusing good? Is it scary good? And that stuff, like, to me, it's just, is it good or bad? differentiating it further is often only helpful when I'm figuring out my emotions and I realise what I'm saying. And because when I'm figuring out my emotions, see, to me, the indication of my arm moving from sitting on the laptop to being in front of my chest feels a more defensive body language, and to me that's me reading my emotions. That kinesic mechanism of body language is either a syllable within a word of Malcolm's vibrational wavelength equal to the emotion he's feeling, as well as a clause in a sentence or a sentence in a paragraph, or an operation within a larger operation, or just the result of neurons firing in a particular pattern because the preceding pattern was that of discomfort, and when I've reached that threshold of discomfort previously, the ingrained response, the habitual response, the encoded response was become defensive, hide your emotions, fight back. And because in many senses fighting back when it comes to emotional contexts, when it comes to emotions, is frowned upon. And yet I have to figure out how to discern emotional communication from combativeness, because expressing my emotions isn't necessarily a combative event. And because my emotions don't need to be interpreted as a combative event, that's not a knight, that's a pawn, I can reconfigure my emotional states to be more precise in their description of my physiological state. Because with identification of the physiological state contributive to my affective state, I then develop my understanding of psychology as well as sociology, and from there it becomes easier to identify how those words are interpreted, generally speaking, and gain utility from them. So the utility I'm describing in this manner is that of linguistic utility, because if I understand how people, as generally speaking, define their emotions, then I can interface with reality somewhat more usefully, because instead of receiving psychologically formatted emotional input as unnecessarily simplified, I can see it as an option to develop more efficient communication. I can have a more cohesive integration of self with, hang on a minute, is that, no, because it'll take the bishop up, and that's why that wouldn't work. Okay, so because psychological language affords me the opportunity to be understood more precisely because of the additional vernacular in my vocabulary, then the corpus of my cortex becomes increasingly sophisticated, and if the corpus of my cortex becomes increasingly sophisticated, then I have a higher value. And for me, it's trying to describe. So a big part of my communicational style is removing fluff from the language so that everything I'm saying is as purposeful as possible and precisely delineating my intention. And because I often feel many people aren't as rigorous in their emotional regulation via hydration, hygiene, nutrition, as well as socializing and exercise, I often feel it's not even lonely, it's just different. And I'm okay with that. I don't feel this need. The term introverted is not inaccurate, it's not specific enough. And for me, defining myself as introverted, I remember hearing this description recently as an introvert is just an extrovert with taste. It's like, yeah, somewhat opinionated. However, the principle I'm describing here is that I'm happier in the company of a few good people, and I mean really good people, people that I can talk to about really complex, nuanced topics of great breadth and possibly greater depth because of the collective intelligence at hand, than having a smaller group of friends that discusses what's in the news or what post they found on social media or whatever television is entertaining them that day. Because I don't find that interesting and I don't find it stimulating. And for me, and this isn't meant to be dismissive as much as it's meant to be diminutive, the specification of language I prefer to me feels like I'm describing my emotions deeper because of the bypassing of conventionally accepted affective labeling, of conventionally accepted affective labeling. Because for me, if I can describe the chemistry in my mind as fluid dynamics around a neuronal substrate, then how is that not more interesting? In in some sense of the idea, that is how I feel. And I'm happier describing my emotions from that perspective because to me, instead of describing myself as feeling an emotion specifically, I get a way, way broader scope of affect. I feel more because I'm describing it mechanistically. And I acknowledge that different people communicate differently, and I acknowledge that different people want to communicate differently, and I acknowledge I am as different to other people as other people are different to me. And the more I can comprehensively communicate a cogently cohesive vernacular as part of a vocabulary, systematized as best I can, See, for me, I'm being attentive of the 4:2 ratio of C's to V there is a 2:1 expansion of the ratio for a subliminal CV, because I get that bored with language that I have to integrate all these additional things to keep me stimulated. Because having all these various ratios and hearing, thinking like ratios of consonants with vowels, or adjectives with nouns and verbs, or the phonology of numbers within words, such as saying, oh, hang on, it's good of you to do that for one, or like, for you to do that, that's really good, or consolidate the form today. To me, I hear numbers, and once you start hearing those numbers, you don't stop hearing those numbers. Start hearing them. The thing is, it's framing it that way. And here's my check. 4114. Is this numbers, man? It's part of why I find mathematics so fascinating, because it makes sense of the linguistic patterns I interpret all the time. And given that the reverb of, well, unintentional reverb has occurred again, we'll continue speaking and see how I feel. And I mean that really, really literally, because I am observing how I feel. To me, it's all very, very reflective. And interestingly, now that the reverb's on, I feel more comfortable speaking in a more adventurous context, because I was going to start describing the quantum mirror that I feel is constitutional over reality. As in, my environment is a reflection of me and my emotional state. So if I can define a homeostasis of effect that metabolizes a biochemical formula proportional to my optimal state of being, aka figure out how to design systems that make me feel how I want to feel, not only am I describing it in a more technically correct vernacular, which I'm also practicing my linguistic skills for various assignments and qualifications that I am in the process of acquiring. Because as much as something such as dialectical behavioural therapy or law of attraction or neurolinguistic programming specifically hinges upon the principle of cognitive reframing, I feel that the most successful effort I made with cognitive reframing in terms of managing my own mental health, as well as my physical health, as well as my personal and professional life, is an evolution of the reflections I see everywhere, such as how I pack my bags, the sequence by which my wardrobe is organised. To me, if there's always a system, then there's always an organised pattern of thinking, and if there's a consistently organised system of thought, then it becomes far easier to encode useful data, as well as update the system with Bayesian recursion. Every previous iteration of data improves the next iteration. In the same sense, the more chess matches I have with myself, figuring out initially the equivalency of Boolean algebra and ordinal utility as logic gates to define how I feel in terms of good and bad. I can then develop the Boolean algebra into algebraic geometry as a representation of the fluid dynamics, perpetuating the affective states within the bandwidth of my effective range. In the same sense that if Boolean algebra is to ordinal utility as it is to good or bad, then algebraic geometry or differential algebra or any other form of symbolic conversion notation is a way of representing cardinal utility. It tells me how much I'm doing that, which is why I feel ratios in the idea I have in my dissertation and amidst other ideas of ratio-based combinatorial conditioning effects as a consequence of digital marketing, because all of our behaviours ultimately can be described as ratios. For instance, when we sit at the dinner table, I have a fork in one hand, a knife in hand two, and let's say the dinner is steak and vegetables, okay? I've got steak, got the sauce, got some broccoli, some potatoes, and, I don't know, maybe some spinach. Yeah, okay, I start with the steak. Put it in sauce, it's a 1-to-1 ratio in terms of ordinal utility. I go again, steak, sauce. Great, I've now had two 1-to-1 events occur. Do I now consolidate that into a 2-to-1 ratio of, for every two consumptions of solid state caloric substance with a sip of water and repeat that, because sometimes I'm very specifically doing my best at systematizing at that level and with further detail, and sometimes I'm permitting myself a more free-form behaviour where, okay, I acknowledge that I have cognitively exerted myself beyond my typical bandwidth. Zone of proximal development necessitates I push a little bit further, so we push a bit further. And then, okay, well, in certain contexts, such as physical and mental exercise, if I'm doing mathematics or jiu-jitsu as a mental and physical exercise respectively, then pushing myself against a contextually appropriate difficulty of puzzle, whether that be algebraically or geometrically, because to me algebra and geometry can equally describe jiu-jitsu as much as positional fluidity and submission variety describe mathematics. Because to me the algebra of mathematics jiu-jitsu is a linguistic conversion of terms in the operation as there are used in the sequence, in the same way that there are letters in a word, or syllables in a word, or, words or clauses in a sentence. And the same idea through paragraphs and sections and chapters and volumes and everything. And then that idea geometrically is just, okay, so if you take the simplex of points and lines, create a triangle, and eventually a tetrahedron, and then start mapping out further triangles or tetrahedrons, and develop an intersection of 2D and 3D detail, eventually the jiu-jitsu network makes more sense. And okay, so that arm bar connects best with this omoplata, connects best with triangles A, just because 3 squared is 9 is I in the Roman alphabet. And I see something that could have been useful from within, but I didn't find it minimally useful. Point stands is that's kind of how the system works. And because the system works in real time, there's a degree of abstraction necessary to optimize throughput. Because if I'm describing exactly how I feel in psychologically appropriate vernacular, I feel slowed down, and yet at the same time, that displacement of velocity, which is aesthetically pleasing, yet arguably correct if you think about the idea of measuring motion and position simultaneously. Anyway, so that displacement of velocity, for instance, thinking faster or slower, is the idea of if I'm thinking slower to deliberately consolidate the chemical bandwidth I'm perceiving and perceptually inhabiting. If we think of unified fields, because the linguistic perception of what I'm doing is arguably consider one day is one sentence, and there's 3 clauses, maybe 4, morning, afternoon, evening, and night, then we could even say day and night, and then morning, afternoon, evening, and have those proportions be linguistic equivalents of paragraph 1 and paragraph 2, with 3 unified concepts distributed across them as a continuation of the temporal quality of sun exposure we get at various seasons. Which seems really tangential to what I'm talking about to me, but it's the same idea of displacement of velocity. That change in speed of me thinking by using psychologically situated vernacular is at the same time a communication of the behavioral cycles continuously at work within my mind, in the sense that I can go between high energy outputs, such as first thing in the morning, training jiu-jitsu, getting in the library, doing my best work, and then as the evening goes on and the accepted fatigue of being alive happens, we could, shall we say, anecdotally becomes the winter, and then goes to sleep, you wake up and it's spring again. And to me, that's the same idea of. Actually, I kind of like that idea. It's the same idea of relationships having cycles of spring, summer, autumn, and winter. There's the part where you get to know each other, and there's always potential, and then there's the romantic honeymoon part, and then there's the wistfulness, and it's really how you approach winter. Because if you approach it with the idea that winter is an opportunity for, pardon my forthrightness here, cuddling by the fireplace, or specifically travelling to see family, or snowball fights, or getting to wear lots and lots of coats and feeling really cozy all the time. This, to me, feels a precise way of expressing emotions in alternative language as a quantum function. And it's not meant to obfuscate my emotions via buzzword name dropping the phrase quantum as a prefix, as much as it's genuinely, if we exist within a universe that contains quantum fields, then you're all consistently in quantum fields. That is a contingency of existence. So, if quantum mechanics at the molecular and submolecular level function in a way where things are and aren't and are both and are neither and over all those, then my affective state must function within the same quote-unquote laws of reality. That's, to me, the logical continuation, which then you can get into quantum mind theory and quantum social science, which to me, if you start thinking about it, then further validates quantum cognition and opens up the prefix of quantum to every science. And then you have the classical theory of we live within a very simple world of binary instantiation. And then as soon as the recursively alternating pattern of binary input is observed and the waveform collapses as per a string of digits in machine language representing a thought process, because the thought process is a vessel of emotion. Describing the physics of the emotion is still describing emotions. And I realised that I've created somewhat of a whirlpool of biochemicals with what I'm describing here, but the principle of the matter is effective language has value and is very, very useful in a very broad set of applications. The challenge I'm setting myself is identifying spaces and times where it's most advantageous for me to speak in a psychologically defined affective vernacular as opposed to my more comfortable quantum psychological vernacular. And I will continue to do so, and I will speak in both classical psychology and quantum psychological, classic psychological and quantum psychological vernacular as part of my general vocabulary, as long as I can breathe air, as long as I can be honest. You hear the CBA, you double down, you hear the pattern, you reinforce it because there's a continuation there of the 3, 2, 1, which then becomes a ternary term, algebraic operation, of converting consonant expressions as a 2-to-1 ratio with vowels, as well as 3 phonetic sounds in relation to that 2-to-1 ratio, which then starts becoming more than, if you think of, if I'm looking at 2-to-1 here, you're looking at 1-to-2. So both events are happening concurrently, in the same sense that I can have 1-to-2 here, that's 2-to-1 for you, and then expand the idea that 4-to-1 for me, following my music to the nth theory of there being 4 bars in measure of music, as well as there being 8s and 16s and 32s, as well as 64 squares in a chessboard. All, to me, it's, the truth is just so fascinating. It really, really is. And my intention, as I said earlier, is to illuminate, not obfuscate. And whilst I certainly accept that consolidating as well as elaborating have great assistance in developing a comprehensive estimation of my emotive state, I also feel that the degree of speculation that comes from integrating additional elements such as classical psychological vernacular adds more elements to each set and respective subset and provides more terms for me to multiply, divide, add and or subtract with. Plus exponents beforehand, plus roots beforehand, plus logarithms wherever you fancy doing logarithms, and like calculus and all the various bits and bobs beyond that. So, with all that in mind, I feel I've reasonably well expressed my trains of thought and food of thought as a train of thought to me, and this seems tangential, but it's an idea I was having earlier that for me, this is how the whole three triangulation works in my head. So this is the tech for future idea, is triangulating food for thought. You could think of starter, main course, dessert, in the sense of you introduce somebody to a topic, like with an abstract of an article or the introduction to a book. You then serve the main course, the main body of work, and then you offer various desserts, such as a succinct conclusion or an outro, or you could even consider the reference section, depending on how much you like academia, as well as being part of a greater, that's the 2D triangulation, the triangle itself. Then the 3D triangulation, you could argue, is the train of thought, because the train of thought is part of a more abstract, algebraically compatible representation of neural behavior. So because the neuronal behavior can be converted into neurophysiological events, as well as monitored with various neuroimaging techniques, you could then even argue that a more primitive form of neuroimaging is simply simply writing down your thoughts in as unfiltered a method as possible. And you could then also argue, again, this seems tangential, but it's just me connecting the tetrahedron, that my body language is a intrinsically derived neuroimaging technique, whilst not necessarily being definable as a technology. It is a technique, in the same sense that if you have a sophisticated enough measuring tool, the equipment can identify the wavelength of my speech, such as microphone recording levels of volume in my voice, and as technology becomes more sophisticated, they can pick up on tonality and respond accordingly. The fact of the matter is, I am describing my emotions, I'm just describing them at a different layer. It's the same idea that a technological neural network has multiple layers inserted into decision trees representing neurons, as well as the various nuclei in neural tracts in a biological neural network all have their own ways of encoding data. And this is where I elaborate speculatively as part of, for me, an oscillation where the trough is the consolidative description and the crest is the elaborative speculation, although arguably they're both speculative because you have to figure out as it goes sometimes. The point of the matter is those peaks are improvable, and the more you work at improving the upward trajectory of both trough and crest, you then get a better idea of how your neuroelectro chemistry, the electricity going on in your mind works, and then you could even argue that there's analogies with measurement of peak amplitude, in the sense that you can, once you figure out how to measure amplitude between peak and peak to peak, you then figure out where you are in your behavioral cycle. So for me, it's more that idea of identifying when you're feeling good or if you're feeling bad is part of that peak to peak amplitude measurement. It's just describing psychological operations with physics terminology. It's still psychology, just from a different perspective. Okay. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed every minute detail in its excruciatingly intentional precision. Yeah. That's that for this week's. That's that for today's episode, pardon. I hope you have a very lovely day, a very lovely night, and I will see you next time. Cheers. Bye.